Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. While we're waiting for people to come in, we have a little poll that we'd be happy to have you all answer. Jonathan, if you could get that up, I don't actually see it after all in my menu. So just this one question. Um, Feel free to answer it or not, but it's kind of interesting to have a little bit of a conversation starter and a reference as we kind of get this conversation going. So. All right. And while people are filling that out or not filling it out, I will go ahead and welcome everybody and introduce our two panelists today. And then Jonathan, you can just kind of close the poll whenever you feel like you've gotten a good couple of good results. We might see them pop up on the screen for all of us too. But welcome everyone. I'm Maria Doherty from Housing Forward Virginia, and I'm glad you're all here with us today. This session is a part of our From Data to Decision series, or kind of our larger zoned out series, where we look at how communities can use research, mapping, and local data to make better decisions about housing, and increasingly about how housing and other topics intersect, like climate. Okay, here's some results. Great. Okay, so it looks like most of you either regularly use data in your work, or you're not quite sure, which is, fine depending on, what you do and what brought you here and your interest level. But that's kind of interesting to see a good spread there. Thank you all for filling that out. Um, yeah, so I'll just continue to welcome you all. So at the tension, at the heart of today's conversation is this question, the data, or this kind of realization that data can answer specific questions, but just as often it can kind of open up new questions, right? And kind of lead us down new avenues of research. So a map or a data set might confirm what you have suspected about something, or it might complicate a story that you thought that you were telling and you were kind of knew all the answers to, right? So data is really fun and interesting in that way. And both of those outcomes are valuable, we think, but kind of knowing how and when to kind of navigate those stories and knowing how to integrate data better into your work is really what we're here to talk about today. And so we have two speakers today who approach this from different altitudes. So one brings the more national picture, the research tools of what data can and can't do. And then our other speaker kind of brings it down, is going to bring it down here to the ground in Virginia and talk about some real data in our jurisdictions and how you could really kind of make sense of topics using data that we have created and provided through the Zoning Atlas as well as other sources. So with that overview, generally, I'll introduce our speakers formally. So we have Claudia Aiken. Claudia is the Director of New Research Partnerships at the Housing Solutions Lab at NYU's Furman Center, where the work is about building and sharing knowledge to advance equitable local housing policy. She sits right at the intersection of rigorous research and practical decision making, exactly the bridge that this kind of series is all about. She'll set up a national picture, why data-driven policy making matters, what data can and can't actually do for you, and how localities can build their own capacity to work with it with real examples from around the country. So really excited to have her. And so after we kind of have Claudia's section, we'll then turn to Alex Fella of CityWork, who works on housing and climate through mapping right here in Virginia. He does many other things, but that's kind of what he's going to show us today. Alex is going to bring, like as I said, this data question down to the ground, showing us what you can actually learn when you put Virginia jurisdictions side by side and how zoning patterns can carry real measurable climate costs. He also has a book on cities, climate, and affordability coming out, which I'm going to be sharing at the end of the webinar. And I think it's going to be a great book to keep your eye on. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Claudia to get us started. Thank you so much.
All right. Oh, thank you for that kind introduction, and to you and Jonathan for having me today. I'm so excited to be here. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully you can all see that.
Yep.
Okay, amazing. All right, well, I am a native Virginian and a huge fan of Housing Forward Virginia, so I'm just delighted to participate today, and I'll be sharing, as Maria said, some thoughts on what data can and can't do to inform local housing policy making. So first, just a few quick words about the lab and what we do. We are based at the NYU Furman Center, which you might be familiar with. It's been really involved in housing policy in New York City and New York State and at the federal level for around 30 years now. And 5 years ago, Furman launched the lab to really work with cities across the country to help them develop more evidence-based and more equitable housing policy. And we do that work in three main ways. First, by engaging directly with cities, usually by pulling them together as part of these peer learning cohorts where they can learn from each other and tackle a similar housing challenge or pilot a certain kind of solution. Second, we partner with cities and housing authorities and housing providers to study innovative things that they're doing. And finally, we also draw on all that direct work to inform policy and data analysis for a broader audience. So we are big on evidence-based policy, and that's what I get to talk about today, why it matters, how we can achieve it. First, I'll share some quick thoughts about why it's important, and then I've got a set of examples of a few ways that data analysis, including things like mapping, inventorying, surveying, target setting, all those things can inform policy making. And finally, I do think it's really important to just talk a little bit about how we build capacity to harness data at the local level. So in our work with smaller places at the lab, we often find that their housing person, if they have a dedicated housing staff person at all, wears a lot of different hats, and they need practical, real strategies for accessing support with data collection and cleaning and analysis. All right, so why data-driven policymaking? Well, data can do so much. First, data can really reveal what residents' real housing needs are, as well as disparities in those needs between different groups. Data can help us pinpoint which residents may have the greatest needs, but also where investments will be most effective or have the greatest bang for the buck. Collecting and analyzing data about new or existing programs can tell us what's working and what's not. In our work, we also find that data can act as kind of a common language to help very different actors across different policy sectors, like housing and climate, for example, talk to each other and understand how their work relates and connects. Data, of course, can help us set goals and priorities and also then track progress towards those goals so that we can keep ourselves and our leaders accountable. And I bet you can think of other ways that data can inform policy too. But that said, data does come with challenges too. Data sets are usually messy, so we have to work really hard to clean them, to understand what each different data point actually means and what data points may be missing or incomplete, and then get those data into a format that can speak to other kinds of data. And that's, of course, if we can access those data sets at all. So often it takes a lot of time and expertise to pull the data. There might be rules to protect privacy that make the data sets hard to share across different organizations. And sometimes we need data that don't exist yet or haven't been collected. And so then we need to invest time and energy and money into a survey or some other kind of data collection effort. Then there's the analysis, so the evaluation, the mapping, the graphing, the regression analysis, whatever process it is that's needed to draw actionable conclusions from the data, that takes time and expertise. And then lastly, the data usually can't tell us exactly what we should do. So even armed with data, our policymakers still have to decide what those data mean and how to act on them. So bearing all that in mind, I just want to share some examples of data in action. First, how data can reveal needs and disparities. So here I'm drawing from the lab's own housing needs assessment tool. It's a data tool that draws mainly on federal American Community Survey microdata to generate demographic and housing metrics for every city, county, and metropolitan area in the country. So the idea is this tool can maybe be a foundation for those basic assessments that localities need to do to craft a housing strategy. And here I've just typed Richmond into the search bar and downloaded one of the graphs that the tool generates. So this graph focuses on housing cost burdens by income group in 2019 and 2024. As you can see, the share of households who are cost burdened, meaning they're paying more than 30% of their income just to cover their housing costs, that share has grown for almost every income group since 2019. But at the same time, that rate of cost burden is much, much higher for lower income households. So here, those earning $50,000 a year or less. So that could tell a policymaker something pretty important about where they should be targeting housing investment or assistance. If you want to try out the housing needs assessment tool for your community, I've linked it on this slide deck, which I'm sure will be shared. I'll also try to drop it in the chat a little bit down the line. So now let's look at an example of how data could help us target interventions. This is one of my favorite examples. It's from Cleveland, Ohio. A lot of you probably know or have heard that Cleveland faces persistent challenges related to vacant and rundown housing. But in order to actually act on that problem, the city needed more info about the location and the conditions of problem properties. So in 2015, 2018, and in 2023, the city partnered with a local nonprofit called the Western Reserve Land Conservancy to conduct a property inventory. And that means that they sent out 30 surveyors in teams of two to use this mobile app to grade each property they saw on an A to F scale based on a visual inspection, but also pulling in utilities data, local property data, observing things like, is there illegal dumping going on? What does the sidewalk look like? Is it ADA accessible? And that inventory was then used to target both demolitions and rehab investments. It was also used to inform a program to get residents to adopt vacant lots, and also most recently to identify likely lead paint hotspots. And since they do this every few years, you can also start to see how quickly like a C-rated property might become a D or an F, and that helps predict future needs as well, which is pretty cool. And Western Reserve is now doing this kind of inventory for surrounding communities as well. I've heard of similar efforts, one led by a renters' rights coalition in Milwaukee, another by a neighborhood nonprofit in Jackson, Mississippi. So it's pretty cool to see these kinds of mapping efforts take off. So evaluation, this one is near and dear to my heart because a lot of what we do at the lab is program evaluation. This example is from a study that received a grant from the lab to try to understand the impact of a home repair program in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. So the grantee was the Housing Initiative at Penn. They did a great analysis to show that the program was reaching the kinds of homes, the kinds of homeowners that were intended. They really looked at what kinds of repairs were being completed, and they surveyed and interviewed beneficiaries to really understand how those repairs were changing people's lives, which is awesome evidence. But in doing that work, they also turned up some challenges that have maybe been holding the program back. So, for example, they found that after dispatching contractors to a home, the program didn't really closely oversee the repair process and instead tried to hold contractors accountable by withholding a small share of the funds until there was a final inspection. But then they had a hard time scheduling those final inspections sometimes. And so the survey data really captured some residents' frustration with having not enough recourse if something didn't go to plan. Um, all right, I want to also give an example here of how data can create a common language. So a lot of the work the lab has done over the past couple of years has been to understand how housers can better collaborate with other policy sectors to achieve common goals and also build a bigger bench for housing work, which is so important. So one intersection, of course, that we focused on is housing and climate. We did a national scan to try to find examples of successful housing and climate partnerships and to really understand how they got off the ground, why they worked. And one of the things we discovered is that it really helps to find a data metric that speaks to both housing and climate goals. So some folks we interviewed told us that they really zeroed in on energy cost burdens and savings to make the climate work feels super concrete and also relevant to housing affordability. And we found similar things in other cross-sector work too. So a metric like neighborhood opportunity has been really important to get housing and economic development folks to talk to each other. Or the framing around trying to reduce frequent use of public services, homelessness prevention services to get housing and criminal justice people together. And then finally, I think this one is kind of obvious. Data can help us set goals and track progress. So just a quick example here from Denver, which has set a goal to end street homelessness and some intermediate goals as well to reduce it by half between January 2023 and 2026, and also increase the annual number of households served in these different housing programs to 3,000 a year. And this dashboard, which is updated monthly, shows that they've actually met both those goals. This is only one of many of these kinds of things. Other great examples are Boston's housing report card, Philadelphia's home initiative tracker. Um, and yeah, I think I'm gonna leave it there on the examples. That was a lot of them, but hopefully I'm starting to convince you that data can really be useful for driving policy. Um, Before I turn it over to Alex, as I promised, I also just want to touch on some strategies for actually building the capacity to do this work at the local level. So one strategy that I think is critical is just, it may seem like a no-brainer too, but to develop relationships either with nonprofit research and policy organizations like Housing Forward or with local educational institutions. Sometimes a local data project is a great capstone project for students. So one of my colleagues shared an example with me where students worked with Hennepin County in Minnesota to help them make their point-in-time homelessness count more accurate. Or in the Cleveland example, Case Western actually cleans and maintains the city's property database for it, making sure that there's data sharing processes in place for these outside institutions to access and properly protect local data, I think is a really important first step. Another strategy I've seen that I think is promising is when localities bring in neighboring jurisdictions to kind of pool capacity and also funds. So we've seen some cool examples of a regional housing needs assessment or data project that can benefit multiple cities in an area. But even within a single city, we find that data are often very siloed within a single department or agency. So figuring out a data platform or a data administrator that spans different departments could be really helpful. And then finally, sometimes rather than building a new data collection effort from the ground up, it might be useful to think about opportunities to embed or improve data collection in existing programs and efforts that are going on. So is there a way to train intake staff at a housing service provider to ask their clients a few more questions and record those data in a usable way? Or could your code officers record more detailed housing conditions data in a way that you can then use to make investments? All right, I think that does bring me to my final slide. I'm really looking
Yeah.
forward to questions. Don't hesitate to reach out. If you have any questions about this or even just ideas about how the lab could support your community, they would be really welcome.
Thank you, Claudia. I think that that was a really clear picture of what data can make possible and where some honest limits can be when you're kind of working with this resource. And it's really refreshing to hear someone else talking about, those kinds of things. Because at Housing Forward, we are always trying to provide data, and we like to do, we are often doing regional housing studies and assessments. But I think still making the case, or at least showing how capacity can be built over time, is something that we're continuing to do with communities. So thanks for articulating that so well. I want to go ahead and pick up the thread that you kind of left us about housing and climate, potentially speaking common languages, or just how we can kind of get housing data to speak common languages across different disciplines, because I think that's really where Alex is going to help take us next. And so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Alex. Take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Let me just share this and hopefully, let's see, this should be good to go. Can you all see this okay?
Yep.
Hopefully. Great.
Yep.
Okay. Let me And y'all can hear me okay? It sounds so. Yeah, thank you so much, Claudia Maria, and to Housing Forward Virginia. Thank you for the invitation. Super interesting work, and I hope this will tie very closely to Claudia what you were saying there. Um, my name is Alex Fella. I'm an urban anthropologist by training. I run an organization called CityWork, and our mission is to responsibly, as you heard Claudia sort of mentioned there, responsibly democratize data into the hands of communities to empower folks to advocate for issues that matter most to them. And I consult with a number of organizations of all sizes across a fairly wide portfolio to try and spur these conversations with data, including public health, community safety, and economic development. But the bulk of my work sits at the nexus between rental housing and climate change, which is that last piece is what I'm going to focus on today to offer a look at where so much of something like the zoning atlas from Housing Forward Virginia really comes into focus, particularly as you heard Claudia mention, through a conversation with other data sets that might not always be brought into conversation with each other. And this allows us to see the kind of data itself, but also our cities and our states in a new light. So to get into it, one of the questions that we most closely associate with zoning data is around the cost of housing, right? Those two things kind of move together in conversation, the way that zoning impacts a tightening housing supply and impacts affordability. But, what if I told you that the most kind of massive and probably the most impactful climate policy in your city is not some international treaty on carbon emissions or some sort of sweeping federal energy program, but is actually the more mundane, everyday routine policy related to zoning, kind of right now in our own neighborhood. And this is what I want to get at with this question today, to show how something like the zoning atlas can draw into focus a kind of range of questions beyond a narrow set, say, of affordability. And shaped today, like, what is the climate cost of so much sprawl? When we think about single family zoning, when we think about density, what is the sort of climate layer that we can bring into conversation there? And one of the ways that we can measure this is through thinking about how much gasoline that we're burning on a monthly basis. So that's what I'm going to be focused on today. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the findings from a very exploratory analysis using the zoning atlas to get at this. And I will, in the process, try not to geek out too much on the data, but if I do, please drop something in the chat and I will try to explain if I gloss anything. But you don't need a GIS background to hopefully understand any of this. I'm trying to make it super clear. So when we talk about bringing in multiple data sets, again, as you kind of heard Claudia just say there, we have a number of options that help us get at this question of what's the climate impact. And we don't rely on a single source, right? We lean on several. And the reason is straightforward, because each data set only sees a part of a problem. Now, there's 4 data sets that we can bring in here to help us answer this question about what's the climate cost of this sprawl. The Virginia Zoning Atlas, for example, tells us what each parcel in Virginia is allowed to become by right. How much of a place is reserved for detached single-family housing, how much of it is reserved for multi-unit dwelling, etc. Then we layer in the gasoline, which comes from the Center for Neighborhood Technology's Housing and Transportation Index, which is a mouthful. I wish they would shorten that a little bit. You can just say H&T, which tells us how much gasoline gets burned by a household per month. And then finally, we layer in the good old census, as you heard Claudia just mention there, the American Community Survey, which asks people how they actually get to work. Are they driving? Are they solo drivers? Things like that. There's a kind of fourth layer here from the EPA on job access, which is also kind of underneath this data, but I won't spend too much time on that. So now that we gather up our data sets, they help us triangulate this question of climate cost. And the first thing, at least for me, because again, I come from this anthropology background, I'm very spatially oriented, I like to put them in space to see what they look like. And I like to put them on a map together. And this is a map that I've made. I'll make it available for free. You'll have access to this. But basically on the left, it shows some of the zoning data from the Housing Forward Virginia Zoning Atlas. And you can see in the red here is single family only zoning, and in the blue my apartment's kind of freaking out right now. My map is kind of freaking out. In the kind of seafoam blue, there's apartment missing middle is more allowed. And on the right side of this map, when we slide, you can see gasoline burned per household per month. And the more red a particular hexagon bin is, the more gasoline it tends to burn. Now, kind of visually we can see what this is already kind of beginning to tell us, is that places with a lot of single family zoning, again those spots in red, tend to burn a lot more gasoline per household per month. Now, I won't go too much into the details of this map. Like I said, I'll make it available for free, and you can explore kind of cars per household, density and transit jobs, none of which seem to want to load right now on my computer. That's fine. But anyways, I like to think about these things spatially first. And what we see is that these deep red districts are kind of locked to single family zoning, are the kind of neighborhoods that are burning high gasoline. Oh, there's transit jobs and density. Okay, but we'll come back there. Now, seeing a pattern is one thing, but building good policy beyond that is an entirely separate thing. So we kind of have to dig into the numbers a bit beyond the map. It's like going to the doctor, right? Like we don't rely on eyeballing an illness to diagnose it, even though we all probably do sometimes, but it's always good to get, a little bit of a diagnostic to see what's really going on. So I'm going to go a little bit slow here because I really want to make this clear. So for each of the 33 cities and counties in that mapped region we just saw, we did one simple thing, which was measure how much of a place's residential land is set aside for single family only zoning. Nothing but detached houses can be built. And then we asked, does that square with how much fuel people there actually burn, right? And how far they travel to do ordinary things like get to work. And the answer is, it does. And that's what these four numbers on the screen are telling us. Before I read them, just a quick word that on how to read this. Zero, a number of zero would mean that there's no connection at all. So zoning doesn't tell us anything about how gasoline is consumed. A number of one would be a perfect match, which is almost kind of unseen in real world messy behavior in life. But if we look at this first number, our first and nearest to the climate question, which is gasoline, a county's single-family only share in the fuel that its household burns scores a plus 0.53. And that plus tells you that they rise together, that the more land locked to detached housing, the more driving. And 0.53 is a pretty firm, strong link. Now the second number, which is a little bit higher, is driving to work alone. The same direction, about the same strength. The more single-family zoning a place has, the more of its residents are sitting behind the wheel driving themselves to work alone, which we all know if we've ever had to commute in Virginia is a pretty terrible experience. And then on the flip side of that, when we look at the numbers that go down, we see that commuting by transit goes down. As there's more single family zoning, we see transit basically fall off a cliff. No one is commuting by transit. And furthermore, when we look at where there's more single family zoning, we see that the jobs that are actually even reachable in the first place by transit basically disappears. And that's that EPA database I was telling you about. So all those four databases I showed you earlier about bringing data into conversation with each other, that's what gives us these four numbers that we can work with. It's four measures from different data sets that all tell us the same thing, but in their own vocabulary, right? In their own story. And that's what gives us a little bit of confidence that zoning is not just a quirk here, but actually is probably driving some of this. Just as an aside, when we weight it by where people live rather than just population, we see those numbers actually go up. When we weight by population, commuting by transit basically doesn't just fall, it evaporates. Like there's nowhere that people are commuting by transit when we do a population weighted analysis of single family zoning. But that one's kind of for a stats nerd, and just in my limited time, I won't spend too much time on that. So zooming in, that's at the county level, but you might say, well, that's only 33 data points, that's a fair objection. But when we zoom in to the county, onto the census block level, we look at 3,500 different block groups, we see that the relationship actually gets stronger. And I'm zooming in there, hopefully that's not obnoxiously close. But we ask the same question again. Does the pattern kind of where we see single family zoning increase, do we see more driving? And the pattern doesn't just survive when we zoom in, it actually grows. Single family zoning and gasoline use come in at plus 0.58, just shades stronger than the county figure. So the closer we look, the tighter the relationship actually becomes. And you can see that again visually kind of represented here. Okay, moving on. Inside a single county. So you might say, well, what's nice about the atlas is that it lets us do this because we've gone up to the county level, we go down to the neighborhood level, but we can also hold a single county still and look only inside of it. Because maybe you don't want to compare Arlington to Norfolk or Hampton to Chesapeake. Maybe you want to, those are very different places. So instead of comparing a neighborhood in Arlington against Norfolk, with the zoning atlas, we can sort of zoom in and isolate county by county to measure within that. And even when we do that, the same findings hold. Take every county and sort its neighborhoods into 3 groups by how much single family zoning there is, from the least, where about a fifth of the land is detached single family, up to the most, where it's nearly 90% single family. Again, we find even within a county, the least single family neighborhoods burn only about 55 gallons a month. The most single-family zoned neighborhoods within a city or county burn about 63 gallons a month. That's 8 gallons more every month between neighborhoods in the same county, again, drawing in basically the same job market. And just to kind of move towards a close here to provide a worked example, let me bring that down to kind of crystallize a bit of what I've said so far. So by looking at Arlington and Loudoun counties. Now, these are 2 counties that share the kind of same Northern Virginia labor market. One kind of regional economy, one job pool, which is precisely kind of what makes this pair useful, I think, to look at. Arlington, for instance, has set aside 17% of its land use for single-family housing. Loudoun has set aside 88% of its land for single-family housing. So one leaves most of its land open to other kinds of homes. The other has very nearly closed its door to other kind of multifamily homes. Now, if your eyes just sort of glance down this column, because there's a lot of data there, what's interesting is that gasoline use in Loudoun is basically double per month what it is in Arlington. And if you go down to the bottom there, jobs reachable by transit in 45-minute, Arlington, you almost have 500,000. And in Loudoun County, you have 0 jobs, according to the EPA, that are reachable by transit within 45 minutes. Right. And if you think about what that 0 means for someone in Loudoun, like picture what it means for a household. If you're a teenager trying to get a summer job, or you're like barely struggling with the massive financial burden of one car, let alone the need for a second car. If you don't have that, you're entirely locked out of the local economy. There are no jobs that are accessible to you there. So you have to burn gasoline to get to work. Interestingly, Loudoun is the more expensive of the richer of the 2, which some people would say richer counties just drive more, but when we accounted for that, wealth only accounts for about 11% of the variation in gasoline burn, so it's really not a story about wealth. Gloucester, I won't dwell too much because I want to be mindful of time here, but it's a kind of similar story where single-family zoning there is nearly 100%, and they're burning an extraordinary high amount of gasoline. To just address maybe one question here to briefly close on this, 2 potential objections. Did we just cherry pick this data? Some might argue out of all the ways you could have measured zoning, I went hunting for the ones that kind of flatter my own story, and I'm only showing you that. But I didn't do that. And that's kind of what this chart on the right is, on the left is showing us. Where when we measure this phenomenon in 4 different ways, we look at how restrictive a place's zoning can be. Not just looking at single-family only land, but we are also looking at whether 2 or more units are allowed by right, whether missing middle housing is permitted by right, or how big required lot sizes are. And again, all this data comes from the Housing Forward Virginia Zoning Atlas. On every single point here, the data goes in the same direction. The restrictive measures go with burning more fuel, more gasoline. The permissive zoning goes with burning less gasoline and less fuel. If we cherry picked the data, these bars would be a kind of scattered mess. Some are limp, some would be pointing in the wrong direction, etc. But in general, they tend to line up. And the last point, again, to close here, is aren't I really just talking about density? Right? Some might say, well, I keep saying the word zoning, but aren't you really just describing density? Like, dense places drive less no matter how they're zoned. We could imagine a super dense single family phenomenon where it's like just a ton of single family houses densely sort of on each other. And that's true. That is a fair claim. So we tested that directly. And on its own, density is a strong predictor of gasoline, even stronger than zoning is. If you had to bet on one thing to explain driving, you would bet on density. But even when we hold density constant, when we control for it and compare places with like density and ask whether zoning still matters, it does. It does quite a lot. And for example, here, Falls Church and Manassas have roughly the same amount of density, 3,200 people per square mile. Falls Church is 52% single family. Manassas City is 72% single family, and Manassas burns basically double the gasoline that Falls Church does, even within places that have very, very similar density. But to be clear here, this is where I want to close with my final point. Zoning is not just wearing a different hat for density. They are kind of separate here, which isn't surprising because density isn't really rival to zoning, right? It's the channel through which zoning works. You can't legislate density into being. Lord knows cities have tried and failed like every time. My God, think of all the cities that have tried to legislate art districts into existence and failed. I'm looking at you, Virginia Beach, with the Vibe District. No shade, but it was not that great. When a locality legislates, though, what may be built in single family only rules, large minimum lots, prohibitions on duplexes, massive parking requirements, zoning sits upstream of density, right? And here's that key point, and I hope it ties together what Maria said and what Claudia said. A locality controls very little about its transport emissions, right? It can't really do much about transport emissions, but it controls a great deal about its zoning. And when a plan reserves nearly all of its residential land for detached houses, it impacts the price of housing, of course, but it's also deciding, sometimes years in advance, how far people will have to travel, say, to get to work, where jobs will be located, where businesses will be located, whether a car is a choice or a requirement for the economy. We tend to picture climate policy as this sweeping international framework, COP 1 million in Ecuador, where treaties are made and broken just as fast as they come around. But when we compare these multiple data sets, when we bring these kind of disparate things together into a conversation, we see that so much of, say, our climate policy is shaped by our geography long before we even put a key in the ignition, right? These policies don't exist in a vacuum, and leveraging different data sets can help us see how zoning is never just about housing, that actually permitting duplexes or townhomes, small apartments, near jobs or near transit is itself a kind of climate reform, right? It is also, and this is the thread I've kind of been pulling on, a means of unwinding some of the driving that a place like Gloucester would otherwise be completely locked into. But it's only through bringing these data sets into conversation with each other that we can start to unlock some of these insights that are really sitting right in front of us that we might not otherwise see so much. So I will post a link to this map so it'll be free for everyone. You can explore it yourself, but otherwise I think I might have gone a little over, but thank you so much.
No, did great. And thank you so much. We really we knew Alex was a talented data analyst, so we said take the Virginia Zoning Atlas map and like do something with it. What can you do with the data that you have access to kind of help paint this picture? Because I think one of the things we've been really trying to do at Housing Forward is we're always trying to share data about housing and share the resources that we've built or that we have access to. But with this new zoning initiative we've been, promoting the last year plus, I think we've really been trying to share ways that you could use these new tools. Sometimes when you create a new tool, it can take a little bit of time for people to really uh, understand how they could apply it in their own specific use cases. And so we were really hoping that Alex could kind of help illustrate that. And I think he did that excellently, helping us tie together, climate cost and land use in a kind of concrete way with all these different data sources, really illustrating why using multiple sources is important, and it kind of helps you build a story that maybe one single statistic couldn't. I also really appreciated that you spent time, talking about the cherry picking and whatnot, because I think, you can introduce new data, and it's really important to make sure that as you're doing that and you're kind of seeing the story that's being built, that you are genuinely listening to what is being said and that you're not just kind of selectively, hearing or reading what you want to in the data. And I think sometimes we have experiences where we have what Alex just showed us. It supports a narrative and it really kind of strengthens something that you were suspecting already. And sometimes data can come in and kind of lead you down a new path which is not right or wrong. It's just like, oh, there's a whole new kind of aspect of this problem that I had not thought about or realized before. So thank you both so much. I have a couple of questions that I kind of wanted to moderate between you two first, but then we will absolutely have time for public Q&A, and then I'm going to be sure to share all of the resources that you guys already mentioned, along with some other things. So, all right, let's bring you both together here before I open up the room, and I'll start with some of the questions that I've pulled together. So for both of you, either one of you can answer this. So we were able to hear, thanks to your kind of really great co-presentation, that there's a national view of data and a lot of different examples of how data can be used in different situations. And then we also were able to look at Virginia specific data and kind of how you can narrow your focus locally, right? I guess I'm kind of curious generally, where do you is there anything happening on the ground in Virginia in terms of data or in terms of research that is like surprising to you relative to national data, or do you feel like it really tracks a lot? Like, I guess, especially maybe Alex might have some interesting answers about climate data specifically, since you're from the coastal area of the state. But yeah, I'm just curious how Virginia compares nationally or with maybe some of its peer states in terms of data collection, data use, etc. And answer that however you'd like, because I know, Claudia, you also work with localities a lot too.
Yeah, Claudia, I'm putting you on the spot. Do you want to go first?
I was going to invite you to go first.
It's such a good question. I don't even know where to begin because my mind first goes to kind of the national all-out war that we've seen on data in the last year. I mean, gutting of departments that are monitoring, collecting the data, shutting down, limiting access to data sets that were previously public, going back and scrubbing and removing certain categories of things from data sets that were previously available. So that's the first place my mind goes is like on the one hand, we have more data than ever before, it seems. Like it seems like we are just awash in data, but it's a bit like Netflix where like just because you can stream more doesn't mean that like the 10th season of Love Island is actually that good. Like it's not really valuable data. So I worry that my mind kind of goes there first to think about how one, we're in this moment where quality data is being kind of controlled, rescinded, put behind certain paywall accesses. On the other hand, we're seeing more data available than ever before, but it might not be quality. It might not be, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out in terms of decision making. But when we bring that down to the Virginia level, gosh, I mean, with climate data, it seems to me, and I'm trying this out. I don't know if I fully believe this yet. So Claudia, I'm really curious what you think too. That so much great work is not even being done in like public institutions anymore, but it's being done in nonprofits and being done by individuals in the academy who are kind of making their work available for free. That's out there. You kind of have to know where it is a little bit. You kind of have to know who's doing it, but these data sets are kind of floating around, maybe less accessible than they used to be. I'm particularly thinking about climate data where we've seen, rollbacks of all sorts of things there. So, at the same time, I'll just say one last point, just to enter my mind here. Citizen science projects like Catch the King by Wetlands Watch. Full disclosure, I'm on the board there. I'm not trying to plug the organization, but hundreds of people that come out and like map flooding in their neighborhood to try and provide new data that updates or gives a more robust look of what flooding looks like in their community that might be missed by the EPA or by NOAA or other organizations that undercount flooding. Those things are very heartening to me. Like, I think we might be seeing data move from that federal centralized area into more of the communities that are using them. And I think it can be a downside, but also has great benefit to it, to engaging communities. I don't know if that answers your question.
That really resonates with me too, Alex. And I think, as we've seen the federal government in some ways step back from being that provider and sometimes analyzer of data, we have not seen the appetite for data at the local level change at all. If anything, it's grown as they try to navigate some of these big policy shifts at the federal level. So I remember, last summer we worked with a group of 3 cities, including Charlottesville, but also Chattanooga and Louisville, to really try to understand where do different federal funding streams for housing flow, which programs do they actually support in which city, and then given that, which ones are really at risk and what are the contingency strategies cities need to have as they continue to try to invest in housing assistance and other housing programs. So yeah, I would say that the need is as strong as ever, and we see it, in Virginia, but really in every community we work with.
No, thank you. Those are great answers, and I'm glad you brought up the federal level piece too, because that's absolutely a challenge and kind of a new world that we're living in terms of, just how to adapt to the way that the federal level of government has been, yeah, either rescinding or collecting data in a different light. Certainly something that we at Housing for Virginia have also been trying to do, where we're like kind of similar to sounds like what you were describing, Claudia, of understanding where this funding comes in for different programs and what will be affected by changes that have been made on that level. So no, that's super interesting. And yeah, I think we're living in a very in general, right? Data democracy. I mean, maybe not in other ways, but certainly online, there's more information, there's more good and bad than ever before. AI is obviously also kind of becoming a part of the data piece, like it is for so many other things. And so, there's good and bad, like you said, but I think one really great opportunity there is that, yeah, there is more room than perhaps ever before to have non-traditional actors, non-academics kind of like really learn how to analyze this stuff, handle this stuff, and present it. And so, you know, I'm based in Richmond, Virginia, but I know we have some researchers like Jeremy Hoffman, who was once with the Science Museum here, who I guess he is a more formal academic than maybe some, but he's not, with an organization per se. He's able to publish his own research on heat and climate. And then, I'm from Louisville originally, and I know that Louisville also has some really great data that they've provided through like nonprofits there too. So I think, yeah, there's lots of great places to look and learn now, perhaps more than ever before. Okay, so I have a question now for Claudia, and then I have one for Alex. But of course, either of you can also answer it if it inspires you. Um, but for Claudia, I guess I wanted to really focus on this question about capacity. So for a locality that wants to start maybe using data in this way or really start integrating data more into their work, but feels like they really don't have the staff or the tools or just know where to begin, what is a realistic first step? Like, what have you actually seen work for especially maybe smaller and rural communities that are really struggling with that challenge?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we definitely see this all the time. Um, I would say, a great first step that we try to help communities with is just to like pull the right people together at the table. So, for example, when we're having a peer learning cohort, we don't just bring in that housing planner or community development person. We ask them to also bring someone from philanthropy, someone from a local nonprofit or CDC. And sometimes there is some data capacity that, the city has not tapped yet, but exists in the community. And bringing together those folks to talk about data can be really helpful. Sometimes we're also bringing together, for example, someone from the city and someone from the healthcare system, or really actors that don't always work together, but have unique data sets that could speak to each other and solve specific problems, if that relationship existed. So I think that's really important. We try to do some matchmaking, as I kind of alluded to, with whether it's an academic institution or, as you and Alex just said, we're seeing a flourishing, I think, of organizations that really do want to partner with policymakers to do this applied data work. So some of that matchmaking, I think, can be really, really important. And then sometimes, it's just let's sit down and talk about what the problem is that you're trying to solve, and realistically, what could the data sets be that help you get at an answer? Or is there a process we can think of, over the next 5 years to build in those tracking kind of data points? Um, but yeah, it's hard. It's hard and it takes a long time, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think you did give some really great examples in your presentation, and then just there for kind of like first steps. And certainly, whenever we're hired or brought on to help with regional studies, we often say, like, think of us as like additional capacity for your staff, because I think there is opportunity for groups like Housing Forward to be that in certain situations. But Yeah, it's something that we just are constantly chipping away at capacity building. So, and we're glad that Housing Solutions Lab, is there to provide some great guidance and examples. Okay, so I have a question for Alex, although like I said, anyone can answer it. Alex, I have a question about, I do want to bring up like AI and data curious, the new fads of like how you can kind of sift through what is good and bad data since you brought it up. So how can data curious people maybe approach using AI responsibly or, being able to, maybe not AI specifically, but how can they use these new tools without kind of falling into a hype or without falling into a situation where they're getting garbage in, garbage out, like you kind of described when it comes to
Yeah.
researching a particular topic or using data?
That's a really good question. I have a kind of maybe two level of an answer. One is a high level and one is a kind of practical, how do you actually do it answer. I think in the high level, for sure there is a risk that is very real of kind of opening ChatGPT and saying how many X live in. I mean, even just asking this question, if you open ChatGPT and you say, "What's the relationship between zoning and carbon fuel burn?" It's not going to. It'll probably read a report. It might, if this is on the web, it might scan this and give you this data, which I'm going to stand by. So hopefully, it's accurate. But it's never going to run that. Well, I shouldn't say never, but it currently isn't going to go to the H&T index and pull that and then run a regression analysis in its own kind of sandbox code and then send this back to you and all these sorts of things, unless you tell it to. So these tools are getting better all the time. There's no sense in pretending that AI is not good at coding right now and coding in Python and these languages that data science is done in. It's very good at it. But you still have to know a little bit of the basics of like what it is that you want. And I think that kind of goes to Claudia's what you were just saying about like understanding the question first. I think that's a huge part of it is like getting the question right. Oftentimes we begin with pre-assumptions about our question that we don't ever really interrogate, and then we go looking for data that AI has a very strong tendency to always agree with us. You're right, like this sort of thing, and never really question some of those pre-assumptions. So that's one of the biggest challenges is when we think about garbage data, there's not only like hallucinations and sort of just like bad math out there, but there's also this way in which like bad data to me is one that doesn't interrogate your assumptions. And that's that kind of anthropology angle that I approach it from personally is like, all right, what are my pre-assumptions here that we need to actually put to the test before we even begin building a data narrative that's going to support our theory. So that's the kind of high level. On the sort of practical level for people who are watching and listening who are like, all right, but I still want to use AI because my boss is asking me for this thing and I don't know how to do it. It's very helpful to point your AI tools to the data sets that you want. If you tell ChatGPT to go pull data from the US Census, I might do it. I don't know how the API access works, but I imagine that it's has capability or functionality to do so. And if it doesn't, it probably will shortly. Knowing the data sets that are reliable, such as the census, such as the EPA, even though they are kind of under attack, but knowing that they're still generally high quality, those are really great places to start because you point your AI pair program or whatever to those data sets. But even still, you could sift through all this data and not understand the problem because we haven't properly defined the question. So the very first thing I think to inoculate ourselves against the hype of AI is understanding that it very rarely will challenge your presuppositions, and those sorts of challenges can really only come from webinars like this, conversations with humans, people who have studied in the field. So I think that's the way that I see it right now. But of course, every day it changes. There's always new products coming out. There's always new hype. The Claude Fable 5 they pulled for national security kind of thing. And so it's tough to kind of stay on top of it. But I would say that those are kind of the two
Yeah.
angles that I approach it from.
No, that's such a great answer, Alex, I think. And you were able to bring in Claudia's answer too in a way, which is such a like expert co-panelist move. But it's like, yeah, you really do need to know what your question is. I mean, I think this is something I think about a lot too. You can learn all these new data sets, you can learn how to code, you can learn how to create visualizations, but at the end of the day, having the critical thinking, which just kind of comes with time, experience, and education, self-education, like you said, challenging yourself is still really important because there are times where I'm like, all right, I think I have all the data now, but even figuring out how to what am I actually trying to communicate about it? Is like a
Yeah.
whole question that I often ask myself at Housing Forward Virginia. And you kind of can't just rely on AI to do that because yeah,
Yeah.
you're right to push back on me on that. This is not what you were asking for, is the conversation you'll have. So that was a great
You're
answer.
right to push back.
All right, so we have some questions coming in. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to them, and then, if we have more time, I can add, some of our other questions that Jonathan and I have come up with. But I'll go ahead and start this one. We're going to answer this first question live. Um, what are your experiences with translating this type of data to people or residents that can totally upend zoning reforms? And so I guess another way you could, put this is a question that I had framed, which is like, when you bring this kind of data, whether it's just housing or whether it's housing and another topic. So Claudia mentioned, you could make the case about, uh, the cost on our systems, our public systems, right? If we don't have housing in place for people, how do you kind of see that changing the conversation with people, if at all? Or do you find that it doesn't, yeah, I don't want to paraphrase this question too much, but what are your experiences with translating this data to people or residents that can upend zoning reforms or kind of make some change around zoning reforms once they see it?
Yeah, that's a great question from Emily. And I think, unfortunately, I mean, while I talked about data as a tool to inform decisions, talking about data as a way to change people's hearts and minds is a totally different question. And I think what I've heard is that we make up our minds based on stories more than we are actually processing data, and that so often these are end up being conversations about our values. So we have to come up with narrative ways to frame housing conversations that build on people's values and what they care about. And I am definitely not the right person to speak to how to do that. But yeah, sadly, I've rarely seen cold, hard data change someone's mind. Alex, you
Yeah.
could probably speak to that too.
No, I very rarely will walk away with a meeting with a decision maker or counselor, whatever it is, and not feel like George Bush under the mission accomplished banner. I mean, every time it kind of feels like that. It's completely the case that, I mean, and Clay, I mean, you must be in these situations too, and Maria. I mean, so many people on this webinar as well. You will be in a meeting with decision makers, policymakers, whoever at any level, and I'm talking supranational in my experience, all the way down to just very, very local. And everyone looks at the data and it's nicely presented and it's glossy and everyone goes ooh and ah and they sort of scratch their chins at it and then they shrug their shoulders and click their tongue and walk away and go on the direction that they were going to go originally. The data sometimes feel like more of a checkbox than it does an actual kind of narrative piece or any new capacity to convince someone. Um, I mean, I've been doing this at least for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years. I have no silver bullet on what actually changes people's minds. I've seen good data convince no one. I've seen bad data move hearts and minds. So it's very difficult for me to say, at least from my experience. You have something similar, Claudia. Like very rarely do I see that happen. Um, I wish I had something more insightful to offer.
No.
Yeah, it's very, very challenging. I think persistence is the key, especially when thinking about reform of zoning, where this battle has been raging in Virginia for how many years now? I mean, how long has the NIMBY-YIMBY battle been going on, where there's so much resources dedicated, so much data out there dedicated to this, and we still are at this sort of incrementalism phase. So I think persistence is key. Understanding that one map isn't going to change someone's mind. One stat, one graph isn't going to do it. At least in my experience, I think going back and showing them the chart again and again and again and again and again is the kind of slow, patient work for data. It takes a long time to cook, I guess, at the end of the day. Um,
Yeah.
that's my that's my very kind of pessimistic experience.
No, I mean, you both were very pragmatic with your answer. I think it's true, and it's important for people to know that, we three, and probably more than just we three, some of the people in attendance are all really big fans of data and how data can really help inform decision making and help us learn new things about what's going on a particular issue, but it certainly is not like the answer to like, yeah, changing people's minds, unfortunately. I think Claudia did put it really well. Like we do live according to stories that we kind of have in our mind of the world or of a situation. And so even finding an audience that is, there's a challenge of creating the data, studying the data, there's a challenge of presenting the data, and then there's the challenge of just having a receptive audience that's really willing to like sit with new information or sit with information that they had never heard before and kind of really soak that in. And so, yeah, it's never, if ever, it's a long process. I would agree with you there from our experience too. But certainly with this topic of zoning, and we really appreciate Alex, giving us a great data example of how you could kind of use other pieces along with the zoning atlas to learn some new things. We've really been trying to take the approach you said, which is just be persistent, come to all these different communities, build coalitions across different parties, really make the case as to why some kind of change, we're not saying what that change should be or, it needs to look like in every place, but just something needs to happen to kind of uh, improve material conditions on the ground. And here's what the data is showing us about that, right? So just wanted to support the things that you said there. And we're at 1 o'clock, so we're getting close, but I want to answer, we only have two other questions. I think we can answer them, and then I'll quickly wrap us up. All right, so Abby asks, this is a really great tool. Thank you for sharing, Alex. I'm curious, how did you analyze the directionality of the relationship between zoning and gas use? Is there any possibility that zoning decisions are being made in response to people's transportation habits and not the other way around? I think that's a really interesting question. I will let you answer it, but I also will say I can answer some of this too. So go for it.
Yeah, do you want to go for it? Well, I can say the directionality piece, and then I'm curious, really curious your thoughts on the predating thing, because I'm curious if you know when all these zoning laws were put into place. The honest answer, like, is that proving directionality from this data with this very kind of limited cross-sectional snapshot is not possible, because it cannot tell us really which one came first. What we can separate is kind of zoning from density. There's, and run a regression on that. Like that's kind of here, but directionality is a different question altogether, and it's a causal one, which is not tested for in this snapshot. So proving that arrow's kind of direction would require a temporal analysis at the very least, and a kind of natural experiment or variable which can be held constant to compare it against. I think there are studies at the broad level that do that, especially in international comparisons, which are very interesting to think about, which we can gain a lot of knowledge from. But in this particular snapshot, there's nothing that can be proved in terms of causality just from thinking about the relationship. All we can say is they move together. Why they move together, that's the real urbanism research and the conversations that come in there. So but anyway,
Yeah,
Maria, I'm curious, where
no, well put. I guess I would just say maybe there are some places that make zoning decisions based on people's lived habits, but from what we've seen in Virginia, that's really not how these decisions tend to be made. I mean, historically, zoning really, so yes, as Alex mentioned, a lot of these zoning ordinances to begin with are very old. They're decades old. Of course, many localities now are refreshing them, so they're a little bit more up to date. But in many cases, when a zoning ordinance is made, that's really the ordinance that's going to be stuck with your locality for 30, 40, 50 years. So there's no way that, first of all, that could really track with habits of the lived experiences of residents because that's just the times do not line up, right? But also, we've just really found that zoning really, since the beginning of the 20th century, when it really picked up popularity, was a tool to really codify, I guess, a certain attitude around what types of housing we deem desirable and what types we don't. And so again, that really has nothing to do with preference, individual preferences. It's really about we believe in the American dream of a single family house. We believe in having suburbs. We believe in having this kind of setup, which, as Alex kind of showed you with some of this data, but a lot of us know from our lived experience, just will require a car, or you will not be able to have as much job access, without a car, right? And so it's an interesting question. I think I would love for zoning to be more reactive to things like that, and perhaps we can be going in a future where it is. Certainly, there are more transit-oriented development like zones that are coming into popularity in Virginia and across the country. But I think I would say, Abby, that really zoning comes first, and it kind of just affects the zoning or the transportation decisions that you have to make in general.
I guess
Um,
I would just
yeah,
quickly chime in too, that I think there is a huge need as we see some zoning changes in Virginia and elsewhere to be able to now over time see what changes that actually leads to. Alex was talking about zoning and density being closely correlated and moving together, but I think there are lots of open questions about how quickly a rezoning could lead to density or even transit or other transportation changes that we need to be able to very carefully measure and will require better data, better permit data, better other kinds of data. So lots of room for being able to better measure and track those things.
absolutely. Thank you for adding that. All right. Well, thank you both so much. I'm going to go ahead and do our closing remarks and share our little resource packet. I think if I miss anything, Claudia or Alex, Claudia did already link her stuff in the chat, but Alex, feel free to do that. And also, after this is done, we've been recording this whole webinar. We'll post it. We'll also share the slides and resources that have been shared in our live today. So no one needs to worry about that. But yeah, thank you again so much for kind of really connecting the national research picture to what's happening on the ground in Virginia when it comes to data and comes to zoning and other kinds of resources that we can use to analyze impacts of zoning on the environment or on other parts of our lived experience. And so I just want to say, if you joined us for one of our earlier zoned out sessions on permit ready housing, we have another great webinar to recommend to you all. So Claudia and the Housing Solutions Lab at NYU Furman Center is hosting an upcoming Data Talks episode on pre-approved plans. So it's a similar idea, looking at challenges and lessons from jurisdictions that are putting those programs into practice. And that's on July 9th, and I will put the registration link in the chat. I also want to point you to these other links that I want to share, including Alex's website that he's going to publish and make public for everyone, and also some of the data sources and tools that Claudia referenced. So let me go ahead and pop that in the chat now. And
I
I'll
got it,
also make
Maria.
sure. Oh, thanks, Jonathan.
Yep.
All right. Definitely also please go ahead and check out the Virginia Zoning Atlas if any of you haven't already done that. That is a public resource that's available for you to look at. It's a part of the National Zoning Atlas, which is seeking to do the same kind of mapping and analysis of zoning and land use across the entire country. So that'll be really interesting when that whole data set is done. But certainly you can use all of Virginia now, which has been completed, to kind of do the kinds of data analyses works that Alex illustrated for you. And then lastly, I just want to quickly give a shout out to Alex's forthcoming book. He is a published author soon. His book's on cities, climate and capital and affordable housing, and you can pre-order it. So that's also in the links that I've shared below.
Can I
I
say one
also,
thing? Can I just
of
very
course,
briefly about that? If you
yeah.
cannot afford the book, because I would never ask anyone to pay that price, I don't set it, but you would like to read it, please email me, and there might be one that falls off the back of a truck somewhere in your inbox at some point. So please don't feel the need to spend,
Wow,
I think it's like $200 or something. Do not, just so you know.
so generous. Okay, yeah, special audience perk. I also, if you're interested and if you are, willing to give us a little bit more of your time, I have Jonathan shared that forums link, which is just, collecting stories from people across Virginia about zoning and how it's impacting you. So this one is just one question. It's really simple, like how does zoning affect sustainability in your community? If you have a great story or a great answer, we'd love to hear it. And we might share it in an upcoming blog or other kind of resource. But I think that's really all for today. Thank you for being here. Everything that we pointed to today, including the data tools, the atlas, any kind of story prompt that you might be able to provide us is meant to give you really things to think about and a practical next step for how to use data in your work and in your life. And so we're really happy that you all joined us today, and we hope that you learned some interesting things from these two really awesome panelists. Thank you both, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you so much.